What is the best way for an average person to discover what kind of diet their body needs? What a great question I got from the audience. So I decided to make you guys a video about it. So here we go. Let's dive right into it. I'm going to keep this one pretty short. I have it broken down into 3 points. Okay. Number one is why. You have to ask, when considering this question, why is the person asking this question, right? What are their goals? And that does matter. So let's take a look at some examples, okay? Is it because they want to lose fat, right? For example, if someone is just walking down the street as an average person and they're in great shape, then they may not have any issue or wonder about their diet, but we'll come back to that. On the other hand, if the person, let's say, is overweight, then they may have a different path. They're most likely eating too much, and their best way for them, the best path forward for them, might differ from someone else. But we'll come back to that as well in the next section. So you can see some other examples of why the answer to the question why is important, right? Maybe someone needs to lose fat. Maybe someone needs to relieve some kind of digestive system, some discomfort, right? So then maybe their path forward would be slightly different than the other person. And of course, if you have someone who is in maybe good or average shape, but then they want to build more muscle or elevate their athletic performance or even mental performance, that person too would have probably a different path than the other two I just mentioned. But circling back to the general health and longevity question, the average person who just is asking this question for general health and longevity, okay, well, let's get into what all of these people might do, okay? The premise is the same, it's just that the tactics will differ, okay? So the second word I have here is measure, okay? So in each case, no matter what your goals, I'll leave those up here, you're going to want to measure, because if you're going to make a change, you need to be able to measure it. It's one of the reasons why I always keep a ruler on my desk. Now, whenever you're measuring something, you always want to take a solid baseline measurement, okay? So what does that mean? Depending on the goals, again, it might mean that the person measures their weight and body fat measurement and BMI, or maybe they take a 3 or 4 day food journal so they log what they're eating, or maybe they do a subjective journal or log of sorts, like rating themselves on 1 to 10 for a week on how good or bad their energy is or their emotions. Are they feeling, sad or happy today? You could even do that after each meal. So depending on the person, I might prescribe a different, set of things to measure. But actually, usually these three are like in my men's health coaching group, and when I work with clients one-to-one, I'm usually recording some version of all those three, all right, no matter what the change is. Then, of course, you could be measuring your annual blood work that you get at your doctor, or maybe even some more advanced lab work, although that's not necessarily that last one for the average person. But you may want to know things like your cholesterol and other things before you decide to fiddle with your diet. Okay, so once you have certain baseline measurements in place, then before you make a change, you want to implement some controls, because if you change 3 things or more at one time, or really even 2 things at one time, you're going to always be confounding those variables that you change. So one at a time is best, right? If you're going to make a change. So if you want to know if fish oil is going to help, your cholesterol numbers, well, then you probably should, not make any dietary changes and only add in the fish oil for several months and then take the measurements in the beginning and the end, right? Similarly, if you want to know if eating 300 calories less per day is going to help you lose some extra body fat, well, then you're going to measure in the beginning and do that for, in that example, at least a month. And then, you can assess. There are different lengths of time that we want to keep certain controls in for different reasons. Again, going back to the beginning, right? So if it's a digestive situation, if someone wanted to, say, remove gluten because they suspected a gluten intolerance, that probably should be done for a full 30 days, not just a few days, right? Because it takes time to process out of your system. So each use case has a different duration and protocol, but still the premise is the same. You're going to have a baseline measurement and a certain set of controls, and then at the end of that period that you made the change, the one change that you're seeking to measure, you're going to assess. You're going to take another measurement, okay? Now, let's get a little more specific into how this applies back to the average person, right? So we understand that we need to understand what we're trying to accomplish, and that there has to be a measurement in the beginning and the end, and a certain set of standards or controls in the middle with the change. How might this apply to the average person? Well, There are like simple ways that an average person, if just in the case of general physical health, okay, you might drink, an extra 24 ounces of water every day and only do that change for, a week or two and then see how you feel. And we would come up with a way to measure that. Or maybe you're not, don't think you're eating enough fruits. And so, as most people are not, and so you're going to eat at least 2 or 3 or even 4 whole pieces of whole fruit every day. But you got to do that consistently for a week or two at least. 2 weeks is my kind of favorite period of time to measure changes, most dietary changes. And you would do that. So these are simple. So again, like even though this video may sound a little complicated, actually it can be quite simple if your goal is a simple average goal. But I don't even like that description. That's a very, very worthy, applaudable goal. Now, if you're someone who has like different set of goals, maybe a little more athletic performance, maybe you just kind of looking for a bigger change to make a bigger change occur. Maybe you're eating like a really, SAD acronym, crappy standard American diet, and you're ready for like a bigger change than that. You're like, Matt, I just don't want more water. I want to make a big change here. Well, maybe you would go on for a whole month, 30-day plan that involved only whole foods, which is something that I once did a long time ago at the beginning of my nutrition and fitness journey. And that you could certainly do something like that. Now, quick aside note, most people who are busy and have real lives to deal with, it's not so easy to go from 0 to 100 in that manner, going from a terrible diet to a very strict meal plan. But some people can do it. In any case, this can be good and helpful for you to learn a lot and discover a lot, but there's a pitfall here, which is this via negativa, this process of removal, okay? You have to be careful that what you're measuring, everything that you take, every time if you add something in, you're also by default probably taking something away. And so in this example of, say, someone who was eating a whole bunch of fast food and a terrible diet, okay, and then they go to 30 days of a strict, awesome whole foods, cooking everything from scratch diet. That's not a great system. It's a great thing, right? And maybe I'm sure that person would feel great and lose a lot of weight and maybe never go back. And that's amazing. Then at the same time, we have to remember that we made a lot of changes there. And one of those changes was the removal of a whole bunch of, fast food or junk food or processed food. So in that example, does it mean that because, let's just say this was a paleo diet, okay? In that example, it doesn't mean that the paleo diet was necessarily the cause of, say, that person's transformation. Also, one of the causes of that person's transformation was the removal of all the cake and cookies and, cheeseburgers and pizza. So then there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be aware of that. Because there are many people who do things like that and then they, walk on with the rest of their life waving the flag of like, oh, I did the paleo diet and this is the best diet for everyone. Or, oh, I did, this XYZ diet and this is what saved my life and everyone else should do it. But that may not be true. It's usually not true in most cases, especially when there was a big removal of a whole bunch of other things going on at the same time. So be aware of the difference between causation and, correlation and the process of removal. Other examples, look, if you have someone who, this question is a little for the average person, but if you were someone who was maybe playing sport for college or semi-professional or professional and you needed to discover something at a little bit more of a high professional or semi-professional level, like maybe you're already in great shape and you want to go from, 15% body fat to 13% body fat and you want to be like very precise. You might have to do a bit higher level of scrutiny and precision, but still the process would be the same. You just might have to be a bit more controlled and precise about it. So as we approach 10 minutes, I want to wrap this video up here. The best way for an average person to discover what kind of body there needs is to think about why they're asking that question and what their goals are, and then to methodically measure a baseline and an end measurement, making ideally one, controlled change in the middle at a time so that you can really discover and learn. If you really want to know what's best for you, making one change at a time is probably the way to be the most certain about that.